I am Hannah Riley Bowles. I am so excited to welcome you to the launch of our fall WAPPP research seminar series, which I'm here, I wear many hats at the school, but I'm here today as the co-director of the Harvard Kennedy School's Women in Public Policy program, but also happily just starting this year as a co-organizer of the Program on Negotiations Research Lab, which is co-hosting this event with us. We're very grateful for that. So at the Women in Public Policy program, our mission is to equip leaders and change makers with rigorous evidence-based strategies to advance women and gender equity. And the Program on Negotiation shares our passion for the development of rigorous evidence for practice. The Program on Negotiation at Harvard Law School is an inter-university consortium among Harvard, MIT, and Tufts that is dedicated to connecting rigorous research and scholarship with a deep understanding of practice. So we are really grateful to we at WAPPP are grateful to be co-hosting this seminar with the Program on Negotiation. I'd like to briefly introduce my co-conspirators from the PON Research Lab. Maybe if you guys can just wave. Jared Curhan, the Gordon Kaufman Professor of Management at the MIT Sloan School, and then Julian Zlatev, who is an Assistant Professor of Business Administration at HBS. So both Jared and Julian are admired scholars in the field of negotiation, and both of whom have actually conducted research specifically on gender in negotiation. I'll look for an opportunity to fold their insights into my talk. In this seminar series more broadly, we're hoping that you will gain insights into when and how gender and other intersecting identity characteristics influence the negotiation of work and life pursuits, and also learn about inclusive pedagogical strategies for negotiation skill development. We hope that your participation in the seminar will enhance your capacity to diagnose the effects of gender and intersecting identities on negotiation, and that it will also contribute to increasing the inclusiveness of negotiation education and practice. So I'm grateful now to hand the virtual mic over to Jared Curhan to get us launched. Thank you, Jared.
Thanks so much, Hannah. It is such a pleasure and an honor to be part of this project with you. Hannah is, of course, the main organizer of the project, and we're just along for the ride and really grateful to be here. So as Hannah mentioned, I'm Jared Curhan. I'm a professor in the Work and Organization Studies group at MIT Sloan School of Management. And I'm the co-organizer with Hannah and Julian of the Program on Negotiation Research Lab. I want to welcome those of you who are here from the Program on Negotiation Research Lab, and thanks so much for coming. I also want to thank Diane Long for helping us coordinate this whole project, as well as Nicole Bryant and Guhan Subramanian for providing support for the PON Research Lab. I'm really excited that the PON Research Lab is co-sponsoring this seminar because it dovetails so nicely with one of the lab's main functions, which is to host leading scholars around the world to speak about their research on negotiation. So this fits really well. And I'm also delighted that I have the honor to introduce Hannah, even though many of you know Hannah already. But before I do that, let me just say a few words about logistics for this seminar, since this is the first session of the seminar. So Hannah will present for 45 minutes roughly, and then we'll have 25 minutes for questions from our virtual audience. Sometimes speakers ask that you hold your questions until the end of the talk, but in Hannah's case, and I think I would do the same thing if I were presenting, she says she would prefer to answer clarifying questions along the way. So if you do have a question, please don't hesitate to put it in the chat, and we may invite you to unmute yourself and ask it out loud, or we'll bring it to Hannah's attention during her talk. If you have the opportunity to present your question out loud, we just ask that you please be very brief so that we don't take too much time away from the opportunity for discussion. Hannah's colleague, Laura Botero, and I will be managing the Q&A portion of the seminar as much time as we have left at the end as well. Okay, so without further ado, many of you already know Hannah Riley Bowles. Hannah is the Roy E. Larsen Senior Lecturer in Public Policy and Management at Harvard's Kennedy School. In addition to directing the Women in Public Policy program, Hannah chairs the Management, Leadership, and Decision Sciences area and co-directs the Center for Public Leadership. As Hannah said, she wears many hats, but most importantly for today, you should know that Hannah is a leading expert on gender in negotiation. In fact, Hannah's research transformed the way researchers and practitioners conceptualize gender in negotiation from being a simple dichotomy to a more complex and dynamic factor in negotiation that involves constraints and triggers, which can make it sort of have an effect at some points and not have an effect at other points. And this is an idea that now dominates the gender and negotiation field. So consistent with that theme, in Hannah's presentation today, she's going to talk about when gender matters in negotiation. So I'm really excited for your presentation, Hannah, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Jared. It's very kind introduction, and I'll float on that into my presentation. I'm grateful for it. Okay, so let me share my slides. As Jared presaged, I'm going to talk about when gender matters in negotiation. I'd like to acknowledge right off the bat that this talk, and actually the whole series, is really inspired by a collaboration with Bobby Thomason and Inma Macias Alonso, who both of whom at various points, Bobby and I are longtime collaborators, but both Inma and Bobby were WAPPP fellows. And so I was kind of honored to have this opportunity through the fellowship to collaborate with both of them on this project. And I think Laura's going to pop a link to the paper in the chat box. I am going to talk about a lot of research. It's in the paper. I didn't chalk my presentation with a lot of citations. I'm going to talk about a lot of different studies, but hopefully if you have access to the paper, you'll have all the information to go look up these studies in more detail. So my objectives for today are fourfold. So one, as Jared already set up, is to illuminate contextual factors that heighten the potential for gender and other intersecting identities to influence negotiation. So we want to be kind of analysts of context in this talk. I'm going to close with some strategies for how to limit unwanted influences of gender or other identities in negotiation from an individual level or from an organizational level. And I want to also make a pitch for more inclusive negotiation programming. So a pitch to educators for thinking about how we can make education programming more inclusive. And then I've taken the opportunity through this talk to foreshadow what you're likely to hear from future speakers in this series. So I hope you will stay tuned with us as the series progresses. I'd like to start out, and hopefully this will get people going a little bit in the chat. I'd like to start off with this Dilbert cartoon. I don't know if you're familiar with Dilbert. It's a cartoon series that's actually been running for many decades. It's now published in, innumerable languages around the world, not only in newspapers, but calendars and, desk organizers, etc. It's basically a longtime spoof. I think that Scott Adams, who designed the cartoon series, actually went to Berkeley School of Business and came out making an influence on like how we think about the world of work, and particularly the world of white collar work, and in the tech space. So this is the cartoon series is situated in a big tech firm. And the main character, Dilbert, is a white male MIT trained engineer. And one of the minor characters in this series is Tina, the tech writer, pictured in pink right here. And then her pointy-haired boss, who's just the caricature of an evil boss, who is, is a regular main character in the series. And so this cartoon strip was shared with me by a colleague some years ago who was really tickled that kind of research on negotiation, gender negotiation was showing up in Dilbert. But I remember getting a little bit of a stomach cramp because thinking, I don't know who exactly the joke is on here. So what I'd love to do is I'm going to read the script, and then I'd love to ask the question of you, if you'll throw it in the chat. Who do you think the joke is on here? So Tina walks in. She is a technical writer in this engineering firm. She says, why does Dilbert, an engineer, get 2 computer monitors while I only get 1? And this is actually back in the day. This is a little bit old, when actually getting 2 computer monitors, when not everybody had them. And then the pointy-eared boss says, well, according to researchers, it's because men tend to negotiate and women don't. And she crosses her arms and says, so what happens now? And the boss replies, if I had to guess, I'd say more complaining. Would some people humor me with, who do you think the joke is on in this script here? It's on her. Okay, I really would love to get some replies here.
Yeah.
Tina, everybody's saying the joke is on Tina. What are some other, any other views on him and his employers? Overwhelmingly, we think we're making fun of Tina. Who else? Yeah, she's not being taken seriously, Lisa says. Yeah, makes the boss look sexist. Let's start there. Okay, so Kristen, can I grab you, Kristen, maybe to unmute and just talk for a moment about how the, what's the satire spoof on him?
Kristen,
Or do you see which Kristen I'm trying to unmute here?
Hi, me or the other Kristen who responded before me?
Oh, sorry. I'll do full names. Well, I mean, either Kristen, this is both of you guys kind of made. So I was looking at Kristen O'Neill, but then, oh, this is moving really fast. So it's jumping on me, but also Kristen Lydic. You guys both want to go one after another?
This is Kristen. Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you.
Yeah, I was having trouble unmuting. Sorry about that. I think when I read Dilbert, usually that boss is portrayed as an idiot. And so to have that boss presenting that, that saying what he did, I took it to be more evidence of him being an idiot boss.
Yeah, so. Yeah, being an idiot, right? Yeah, and a sexist also. I mean, there's a whole series on how he's very dismissive of her work contributions, very, very insulting. What about somebody else who was kind of maybe was kind of commenting on maybe Bianca Dreber or somebody else who was actually maybe we should do hand raises, Laura, so I'm not cold calling people, but somebody who highlighted, oh good, Sandra. Yeah, Sandra, I'd love to get your thoughts on this.
Hi everyone. Well, it seems like when men ask for something, they are considered to be negotiating, but when women ask for something, they're just complaining.
Yeah,
that's what he assumes.
Right. So when Dilbert was asking for it, it was negotiating, and now exactly she's asking for it, she's complaining, but sometimes when people read this, they're kind of like, well, she's not really very effective. She is kind of complaining and things like that. What about, did anybody else get this? Anybody see the joke on the researchers? Laura, can you look for hands?
Sure, yeah. Keep an eye out.
Jared's laughing. I might have Jared get in.
Yeah.
Jared, can I pull you in just so I'm not alone in asserting?
Sure. I mean, it seems to me, according to researchers, he seems to be doubting the fact that men tend to negotiate and women don't. It almost seems disparaging toward the researchers.
Yeah, maybe it's disparity of the research. I don't know if it's Scott Adams or the thing, but the thing that was very painful to me is this boss gets to use our research, right? This boss gets to use our research saying women don't negotiate as often as men against this woman, right? And so we can actually create normative expectations that women are supposed to be nice or likable as negotiators. Women don't negotiate, you know. And what I think is really important about this, and for this research, is not only to explain what I think is going on in terms of the contextual factors on gender negotiation, but I'd really like to change the way we talk about this. I think there's a real risk, to the extent to which we are not careful when we talk about gender effects, and they come off like we're talking about individual differences, that we can actually be reifying or reinforcing the stereotypes that we're purporting to study. And I actually think it could be, I think it's actually kind of profound that we could be not helping when we think we are. So I want to go to the next slide. So if you remember only one thing, and then you can tune out now if this is, you want to get the bottom line, but the gender of a person is really not a reliable predictor of negotiation behavior. Gender effects are fundamentally situational. So there were studies way back when that invited men and women into the lab and, you know, or studied them, and, you know, the effects were going all sorts of different directions, right? And so we as researchers, we want to publish research on gender and negotiation. We don't just test for main effects of gender. We actually construct situations where we expect gender effects to emerge. We're not always entirely explicit about that when we publish our papers. But one example is pay negotiations. So much of the research on gender and negotiation comes from pay negotiations. And it's no accident. In part, pay is easy to measure. It's also like a very well-recognized negotiation scenario. So even if you invite relatively inexperienced people into a lab, they can kind of quickly get into the game, or even if you do it internationally, it works pretty easily. But the other reason why we go back, and I'm going to elaborate this in a moment, is that there are many characteristics of pay negotiations that are that heighten the potential for gender effects to emerge. And so it's actually really important, if we are studying gender-related phenomena in negotiation, and we're choosing those contexts in which we're most likely to get effects, that we need to be careful about whether we're overgeneralizing from those situations. Is it about to what extent is about the situation, or to what extent about men and women being different types of negotiators? So what I'd like to introduce during this talk is this framework that we lay out in more detail in the paper. And what we're going to argue here is that you can think about gender and negotiation as being influenced by kind of two categories of factors. And Jared already kind of presaged this for us. One is what I'm calling gender and context here, but it's basically the relevance and salience of gender within the environment. Like, what are there factors in the environment that kind of trigger a sense that gender is relevant and salient? And then the other factor is ambiguity. And that is like, to what extent the situation allows enough improvisation for gender to be these sort of gendered norms or triggers to be influential in our behavior. And so what I'm going to argue is that gender effects are most likely when in situations where where gender is highly relevant and salient, and again, there's enough ambiguity so that gender has potential to be influential. Now, in pay negotiations, and I'm going to return to this multiple times, but pay negotiations are a few things. One, they're highly masculine stereotypes. So even though it really no longer reflects the structure of families in US and other Western societies, we still strongly associate men with being the male breadwinner in a heteronormative nuclear family. And so part of it is this norm, this traditional family norm. Part of it is also we associate men with higher pay and also higher levels of authority, because they actually are more likely than women to be in higher paid and more senior positions. And so when women are negotiating for higher pay, it's a masculine context, it's making claim to a status-linked resource. The other thing that it's doing in a pay negotiation is you're advocating for yourself as opposed to for somebody else. And the feminine ideal is that women are caregivers of others, that they put others before themselves. So you're in a masculine stereotype context, grasping at a status-linked resource and self-advocating, which rubs up against the feminine ideal. And then very often, really typically entering compensation negotiations, the norms of exactly what you should be negotiating for are not clear. And potentially on either side of the party, or either party, because a hiring manager organization may have a certain amount of discretion. And then it's often hard when you're on the employee or candidate side to have clear, real transparency into what the appropriate standards are. So in situations where we can either drive down or where gender is less relevant and salient, and there's clarity on what are the appropriate negotiating norms, what should I be asking for here, what is the process, gender effects in negotiation are actually quite unlikely. So those of us who want to publish papers on gender in negotiation, we wouldn't run studies in contexts that have these characteristics because we would be wasting our time, right? So we're going to look, we typically look in this quadrant up here, like the example of pay negotiations, where we're going to get our effects. And again, that's where we kind of run into risks of overgeneralization. So I want to start off kind of walking through these 4 contributors to the relevance and salience of gender in negotiation. And then I'll walk through the ambiguity piece. I want to illuminate some of the research along the way, and then also some of these speakers that we have coming up, which I'm really excited about. So one factor, if you think about like, how is gender constructed within a situation? Cultural norms are really important, but we can also get a little, culturally myopic, a little ethnocentric in our understandings of gender, and particularly because gender is so linked to biology, we can assume sometimes that our assumptions within our culture about how men and women behave are linked to their biology. But what some new research has been showing in, say, the last 10 years or so, is that actually cultural stereotypes about gender vary meaningfully and systematically across cultures. So one example is matriarchal and patriarchal societies. I mean, interestingly, given we have Queen Elizabeth's funeral today, in matriarchal societies, actually women not only are more likely to be entrepreneurs, have greater occupational attainment. That's not only because of the laws and resources that are provided to them. There's also all these other really cognitive things. Women in matriarchal as opposed to patriarchal societies are more likely to take risks. They're more assertive negotiators. Another cultural moderator is collectivism and individualism. So as kind of depicted in these graphics, collectivism emphasizes focusing on others, the collective ahead of the self, whereas in individualistic cultures, we celebrate, like we do in the United States, individualism, self-assertion, competitiveness. And what the research shows, this is research by Amy Cuddy and colleagues, shows that actually masculine stereotypes tend to reflect the dominant cultural values. So actually, we in the United States associate men with being assertive and individualistic, in part because we live in an individualistic culture. Whereas in collectivist cultures, men are actually stereotyped as more other-oriented, more group-oriented than women are. Women are actually stereotyped as more individualistic than men. And so as a result, it actually, the stereotypic negotiation results that we've been tracking on in the United States, where men are the bit more competitive bargainers than women, and we kind of expect men to be, and we often observe men asserting themselves more in competitive negotiations than women. Those results are actually reversed in collectivist cultures. And we're so lucky to have Vivian Shan Wen coming actually in November, and she's going to talk about this research that she has been part of leading, both experimentally and then meta-analytically, looking across cultures at how culture actually moderates the effect of gender in negotiation. Okay, so we want to think about what are actually the cultural norms that are being activated within an environment with regard to gender. Another consideration is intersecting social identities. So intersecting social identities can either distract from or reinforce gender identities in a negotiation situation. So let me look example, for instance, here at gender and seniority, for instance. So there's some really interesting research by Kathy Tinsley and Emily Amanatullah, where they looked at research showing that women are more likely than men to encounter resistance to their self-advocacy in negotiation. And then they manipulated, though, whether the person who was negotiating was transparently a high status person, an executive, or whether they were a more kind of ambiguously kind of mid-level person. And what they were able to show is that the gender effects were much stronger or significantly stronger for the lower level female negotiator than for the executive female negotiator. So the executive status kind of took over for gender in these situations, whereas the gender status was more salient. There's other research by Alice Stuhlmacher and colleagues, and they found in a meta-analysis just a suggestive evidence that gender differences in negotiation are more likely to emerge when the roles that people are in reinforce the gender status hierarchy, right? So the gender status hierarchy, status is defined by how much kind of resources and authority one commands. And in many cultures, men command more, on average, more authority and status than women do. And so, you know, some of these stereotypes are linked to this relative status of men and women within a society. But for instance, you'll get bigger gender effects if the man is assigned to the role of the boss and the woman is assigned to the role of the candidate, for instance, in a job negotiation, than if you flip the roles. Not always. Actually, Jared's got some really interesting research looking at how men and women put into the role of being a boss, and then when they're made self-conscious, it can lead them to behave in kind of actually gender counter stereotypical ways because they're made to feel like they have to impress and things like that. It makes their gender more salient. But that's an example where we have to kind of think about what are the identities that are most salient. Now, ethnicity is another really important one. So some of my work with May Al-Dabaa in the Middle East, and then there's other work like by Hernandez et al., et cetera, have looked at, well, wait a minute, like, you know, we talk about gender, but what about men from negatively stereotyped or stigmatized groups, from historically marginalized groups in the workplace? You know, are they likely to encounter some of the same challenges that women encounter, for instance, in a compensation negotiation? Ian Ayres, many years ago, looked at the effects of race and gender on negotiating for a car. And what this research is suggesting is that actually men who are negatively stereotyped at work or from these historically marginalized groups actually face many of the same challenges that we have documented for women, kind of writ large, in the research on gender and negotiation, which again reinforces the idea that we need to be thinking about, is this really all about gender, or to what extent is this about status? And to what extent is some of the resistance that women encounter in negotiations or challenges, does that relate to asserting their status in context? And that leads to my next bullet. But before I do, I want to highlight, really fun, we've got Jared Curhan's colleague from the Sloan School, Jackson Liu, is actually going to come in and talk to us in November about Asian identity and negotiation, where there's a lot of really interesting research, not only looking at Asian in this sort of cross-cultural international context, but also what is the experience for Asian Americans, for men and women, and how some of that intersects. And then wonderfully, and I meant to say this at the beginning and I failed to do so, I'm largely talking in binary terms, and I am self-conscious of that. We have a note about that at the beginning of the chapter. And it's a reflection of what the literature looks like, but not my sense, not a personal belief. It's not meant to be a normative statement. And I so regret that I didn't say that right off at the beginning, because there's a lack of research actually on trans or non-binary or gender fluid identities and how they may influence negotiation. That research is, or even intersections with sexual orientation, that research is just beginning, and it is so critically important because it is also another example of where gender intersects with status in context, right? So wonderfully, we have Sridhari Desai is going to come actually next week. She's coming to talk about the interplay of gender and perceived sexual orientation in negotiation. So, I mean, there's really a lot of opportunities to kind of explore, well, wait a minute, what is it gender? Is it the intersection of these things? Which identities are salient when? I also want to highlight that there's also research kind of on the positive side. Laura Cray and colleagues and Adam Galinsky and Lee Thompson showed once, for instance, that women can combat some of the effects of stereotype threat in negotiation. That is the sort of exposure to negative stereotypes that might dampen their performance expectations by making them think about the fact, for instance, that they are professional school students. You know, think about going into this negotiation, think about the fact that you're a trained negotiator, a business school student, or a trained negotiator at a law school, and making that more positively stereotyped identity more salient in one's own mind can also combat some of these negative effects of it. So we really want to think in context about what are those identities that are salient and relevant, both to the self and then, you know, to perceivers or interlocutors. Okay. Now, going back to this idea of how do we think about power in context, right? Or how do we think about how the backdrop of the context influences gender in negotiation? So I have here kind of illustrated, what difference does it make, for instance, if you're negotiating in a male-dominated as opposed to gender-diverse organizational context? And this is really kind of important to think about, right? Because it can influence one, if one is a token or relatively few, they're one of few. Or let me back up a second. If one group dominates an organization, there may be sort of stereotypes associated with that group that infiltrate the culture. So there's some research, for instance, on organizational culture as a masculinity contest, you know, where sometimes male-dominated organizations become infused with these hyper-masculine norms. If you are in an environment that is, for instance, male-dominated and you're a woman in that environment, you just may kind of stick out because you're like not like the others. And so that may make your gender more salient. And so it could influence your negotiation expectations or the expectations of others, that they somehow become more gendered. Whereas if you're in a gender diverse environment and just, you know, or just simply diverse more broadly environment, the fact that you're a woman or, you know, whatever your identity characteristics may just not stick out because everybody's something else. You know, I mean, everybody's got their own distinctive identities. And so it really kind of matters what the organizational context is like. Very often also, if in, for instance, a male-dominated organizational context, if you know, men or one group dominates the organization, that group may also be more likely to have better just access through informal social networks to information about what's negotiable or how to negotiate, etc. So that there may be disadvantages not only related to perceptions, but also information flow, access to resources, access to sponsorship. And that can also influence one's negotiation outcomes. So, oh yeah, really fun. So in a couple weeks, we have Jens Mazai is coming to join us. And Jens is doing some really wonderful work on looking at masculinity triggers actually in negotiation. So it's one of those, another of those areas where, so for instance, what some of his research is showing is that men, so in the same way that women might be inhibited to negotiate by exposure to stereotypes that men are better negotiators than they are, or that it's not nice for women if they self-assert too assertively. Men can also get triggered in negotiation. Jens and colleagues' research is showing with Julia Baer and others that, you know, if men suffer a kind of masculinity threat within the negotiation, or, you know, if they're told this is a competitive negotiation, it can actually kind of trigger more stereotypically masculine behavior in them than they would otherwise engage in. So it's really important to think about what's kind of going on in the context and whether the context might be triggering these things. Okay, And then we think about, I'm also happy, Jared, if you see any questions along the way to get interrupted. But I'll go through one more. This is my final kind of contributor to the salience and factor that contributes to the salience and relevance of gender. And so one of those other things that's really important to think about is, what are we negotiating? And so again, I've already mentioned that pay, we do all these studies about gender negotiation over pay, and it's just a very gendered subject of negotiation. There is a growing body of work looking at gender in work and family negotiations. And what's interesting there is that the evidence suggests that men may feel similar to the way that women feel more inhibited than men about negotiating for higher pay, because they are more likely to encounter resistance when they attempt to do so. There is growing evidence that men tend to experience more resistance than women do, or anticipate more resistance than women do, about negotiating for access to family-friendly work policies or practices. So there is this evidence of not man enough bias, where they'll actually suffer backlash for attempting to do these things that are counter-normative. So had we started the research looking at work-family negotiations rather than pay, the initial discussion might have been men don't negotiate, because they feel more inhibited. The critical thing is that it can be difficult. We have the best evidence on this on gender, but I think there's a lot of reason to believe it would extend to other groups, is that what the evidence suggests is that it's hard to negotiate for things that are counter-stereotypical, or harder to negotiate for things that are counter-stereotypical than those things that align well with your perceived identity. Now, your salient perceived identity doesn't need to be gender. It could be your professional identity or other aspects, ascribed or achieved status characteristics. But the research would suggest that at least in the gender, and likely in other categories, it's doing the counter-stereotypical thing that intends to invite the rub. Now, what's really interesting related to that, though, is this is some of my research and other folks, is that role negotiations, when we did work with Bobby Thomason and Julia Baer, going out and trying to see what do managers and executives negotiate in their careers, where are they, what are the things that they negotiate? Overwhelmingly, they were talking about role-related negotiations. On the margins, men were more likely to talk about negotiating their job offers and compensation. Women were more likely than men to talk about negotiating work-family conflicts, but overwhelmingly, 85% or something of the examples that people were sharing related to their roles. And I think this is actually critically important, because if you unpack the gender wage gap, it's actually more about occupational advancement and the traditional gender division of household labor than it is about equal pay for truly equal work, and so what's really important is that I think that we really should be shifting if we want to be contributing, thinking about in the negotiation field, to how do we address inequality broadly. We should really be shifting our attention away from this pay negotiation conversation more into thinking about the negotiation of roles to enhance, women's and other gender minorities, to enhance, the potential of all groups for occupational advancement, and then to be thinking really about inclusive perspectives on access to work, family practices. And actually, Jared's colleagues over at MIT and Sloan have done some really important work looking at what are the organizational conditions that actually enable people to be results oriented and more inclusive of family and life objectives as one attempts to achieve also organizational aims. So now later in the semester, we're really lucky to have Joe Vandello come, and he's a wonderful scholar, kind of more broadly, of the psychology of gender, a lot of these kind of broader themes that we're talking about, but he has done some research on this masculine dilemma of seeking work flexibility. And then we're hoping that we're going to have a bit of a conversation with him also about, if you think from an intersectional perspective, you know, what are the kind of masculinity norms or prescriptions for men who are in elite occupational categories or white collar workers as compared to, say, blue collar workers. And there's, you know, the normative expectations of masculinity vary across social class, and there's a variety of things that are varying, the structure of work, the access to benefits. So hopefully we're going to get to have a little bit of an intersectional conversation as well with Joe, and Joe is just fascinating to listen to on gender kind of more broadly. And then on role, there's this new book out, the Putting a Stop to Women's Dead End Work. I would like to complicate the idea of dead end work. I think I find that kind of, I worry about that expression that we're diminishing. It's a little bit of an elite view of work. But I think what the really important message in this book by Linda Babcock, Lori Weingart is going to join us, and Lisa Vesterlund, is that there is some work in organizations that is more valued than other work, more what they call, you know, promotable or non-promotable tasks. And the big issue that they are calling out, which is very important, is the degree to which women and often particularly women of color are assigned tasks or roles that are not valued or rewarded within the organizational structure. And so, you know, going back again to this category of dead end work, I would hope that we are kind of complicating, you know, what is that we're looking also at, we're looking critically at what type of work we value, as well as whether or not people are doing the kind of stereotypically masculine promotable thing. But it is a really this will be our final talk of the season. And Robert Livingston, who is a scholar of diversity in organizations, really wanted to get into this conversation, particularly of the implications of this work for women of color. So we will have that discussion toward the end of the semester. So I'm gonna start moving here more quickly so we can have a more open discussion. But we've talked about these factors. What are these factors that heighten the perceived relevance and salience of gender in negotiation, or that may diminish the relevance and salience of gender in negotiation? So how does the social cultural context kind of define negotiation and its relevance? Define gender and its relevance to negotiation. What are the relevance of intersecting social identities that might kind of reinforce gender or distract from it? How does the organizational backdrop influence perceptions of gender, or does it gender individuals or make gender identity more or less salient? And then finally, the subject of negotiation. We talked in particular about pay negotiations versus work family as opposed to role, but there's also evidence looking at things like, you know, there's a wonderful study that by Linda Babcock and Julia Baer, where they looked at a negotiation that was actually long run at Harvard Business School, where it's two automobile executives negotiating over the price of motorcycle headlamps. And they switched it and made the lamps lamp beads for jewelry. And they showed that this stereotypic gender difference that had emerged in this negotiation in past studies favoring men in this masculine stereotype competitive negotiation was erased when they made the negotiation subject less gendered. Okay, let me talk for a moment about ambiguity. What difference does ambiguity make? So I want to talk about three categories of ambiguity: ambiguity about what is negotiable, ambiguity about how to negotiate, and then ambiguity kind of like who the parties are, what stereotypic attributions might be made about the parties. So what's critically important about ambiguity these meta-analyses by Kugler et al. In terms of gender differences in the propensity to negotiate, by Mazai et al. In terms of gender differences in negotiation outcomes, strongly indicate that gender inequitable outcomes in negotiation are more likely when the norms of what is negotiable are unclear, right? And so one is that when it's unclear exactly how to enact a situation, gender stereotypes can be more influential. Another important factor is that, again, going back to, I think I highlighted this already, social networks, right? So if you're entering into a negotiation and you're unsure exactly what to ask for, and if you're from a group that's dominant in an organization, you're probably going to have better information by virtue of the typical patterns of social networks than is someone who's kind of not connected. So for instance, Zoom just told me I was signed out, but I'm still here, Jared. Will you nod me? Okay, good. So there's this amazing work by Jeff Polzer and I think it's Polzer and Seidel, where they looked at data from a company, archival data on the outcomes of pay negotiations, for instance, and they found a significant race difference in the salaries that entry-level workers had negotiated. And then they controlled for whether the candidate had a contact within the organization. And that simple control erased the race effect in the negotiation. I mean, this is really important, the potential role of social networks in this ambiguity thing. And I'm going to come back to that as we think about inclusive negotiation programming. So, oh yeah, and I want to highlight, so now we're in the how section. Sorry, I moved ahead of myself too fast, but moving to the how. So the other thing to think about is like, do I know what to do? And there's research by Cray and Gelfand and others showing that these like gender differences in the propensity to negotiate, you know, pay in particular, this inhibition that's been documented as part of women, or the men's relative assertiveness in pay negotiations as compared to women, that you can get this effect to kind of go away or diminish if you make clear to men and women what the social expectations are with regard to negotiation. Because if women are clear what is being expected, they're less concerned about it. They don't have to worry as much about backlash, and they can go in and follow those norms. Really wonderful research that I think we're going to hear about from Ashley Willens looks at negotiating for time. And she's got some research showing that lack of clarity about how to negotiate for time extensions leads to gender differences in the propensity to negotiate for more time, and in ways that can have costly implications for work performance and for educational performance. And so we're really grateful. She's doing a little, she and I are exploring a little bit of intersectional stuff. So I hope we might be presenting that, but I'm not sure. But tune in for that really important conversation about how do we create norms in organizations that enable everybody to participate in negotiating for things like other than pay, like for time extensions or for other types of opportunities. Okay, and then finally, just a hit on this, ambiguity about who, like the less we know about somebody, the more likely we are to use stereotypes to fill in the blanks of our expectations about them. And so there's a lot of research kind of in psychology around this. Most of our effects that we document in the negotiation studies are negotiations between people who don't know each other. And so if you know the person with whom you're negotiating very well, those things that you know about that person are more likely to be salient to you than demographic identity characteristics. Okay, so we have our framework here for our two levers that we can adjust in order to increase the potential for gender effects in negotiation or reduce them. One of the ones, which I'll get into in a moment in organizational things, is I really like that, even if you can't erase the salience and relevance of gender, you can decrease ambiguity, which I'll talk about in organizations, decrease ambiguity either through your own homework or in an organization to reduce the potential for gender effects. And there are numerous studies, and also the meta-analysis by Mazai et al. Showing that if negotiators just are clear on what they're going in to do, you can get a lot of these effects to go away. Okay, I'm going to hold on this, but I hope, I'm not going to reopen this so we can get to general Q&A, but I hope maybe when you look at this slide now, you're seeing other stuff that's going on in this negotiation context. Maybe you're seeing a masculine stereotyped organization. Maybe you're seeing that Dilbert is an engineer, and which is higher status than Tina's role as a tech writer. Maybe you're noticing that they're all white and they all appear to be heteronormative and cisgender. What does all this matter for assuming or for interpreting what is going on in terms of gender within this particular negotiation? Okay, so for individuals, what the evidence suggests is developing your negotiation skills. Gender effects are less likely when people are more experienced negotiators. There's also research, some research that I have done and other people have participated in and shown that actually, you know, the best negotiation, really this is best negotiation practice in general, to demonstrate why what you're asking for is legitimate and to look for mutually beneficial solutions, that's not only great negotiating practice, but it's a strategy that can also help women, and I would argue people from potentially other, you know, negatively stereotyped groups or marginalized groups, to assert themselves in negotiation and while minimizing the risks of social backlash. You can strengthen your identity as a negotiator. I mentioned that Laura Cray study. Think about the fact that you're an effective negotiator going into the identity, not other, you know, identities other people might throw at you. And again, reduce ambiguity. Do your homework the best you can about what is negotiable, how to negotiate, and who is negotiating. For organizations, I think really the primary thing, and I'll pull here, for instance, on my colleague, my co-director at WAPPP, Iris Bonet's research on how to reduce gender biases in organizations. A lot of it is about reducing ambiguity, about making clearer systems so that managers and other decision makers are not relying on subjective judgments, but on clear criteria. So making more transparent what is negotiable in terms of pay, in terms of roles, in terms of work, family, flexible, and then how to go about accessing these resources. We're writing up some research right now. We have this wonderful case study on an organization, for instance, that created a coaching program for returning parents to work with their managers on how to manage the boundaries of work and family as they were re-entering following a birth or an adoption. And then finally, again, like, who are the parties? How do you enhance talent assessment and networking systems, sponsorship and mentor systems within organizations? And again, collect the data to assess what's going on. In my experience working with organizations on this, organizations very often, they don't even know whether there are inequalities. I mean, it takes some serious capacity to go in and look at these things in a nuanced way. And it's just really important. Again, Iris's research has some good suggestions for how to create these systems for not only implementing debiasing strategies, but tracking them, whether they're being effective. And then finally, I'd like to suggest that for educators, you know, the negotiation field has traditionally been very elite, you know, like the leading scholars are from business schools and law schools and these policy schools. They're really, and our classic cases are, you know, of international diplomacy or of mergers and acquisitions. And I think what we really need to do to make the negotiation field, and actually JARA has been a forerunner in this, creating all sorts of negotiation programming for young people that is consistent with this, that we develop materials that are relevant and identifiable for broader populations of folks, and that provide role models for them, you know, relevant and identifiable role models, that we help people not just develop the skills of negotiation, but also aid them in reducing ambiguity about what in their work environments is negotiable, how you go about in your work environment doing this, and then how do they think about getting to know the people they're working with and people getting to know them. We're working, for instance, with students in technology and engineering who are from historically marginalized backgrounds, and we're working with them not only on developing their negotiation skills, but also getting them networked with identifiable role models within their industries so that they can figure out not only how to be a good negotiator, but what's out there to negotiate and how to go about doing it. And then finally, I think it's critically important, particularly for folks from people, well, for everybody, but I think particularly for folks from marginalized backgrounds, to create communities of learning and support. Similar maybe to what I was just describing. We have, thanks to the program on negotiation and a grant from Carol Hamilton, we've created a resource where we're starting to assemble more inclusive negotiation materials and slides, videos, cases. And we're really excited later this semester to have Melissa Reinberg from Georgetown. She actually came out of HLS, now at Georgetown, and founder and executive director of Negotiation Works. And then also Dan Ames talking about bringing negotiation skills to underserved communities, which is these are folks who are rebuilding their lives coming out of incarceration or homelessness. And they've got some powerful examples to share that they're not going to look explicitly at intersectional perspectives, but in the larger scope of the work that we do, I think they bring a really important underappreciated lens to our field of negotiation. So I will stop there, and in the hope that we have some time for just some open back and forth. So a final thank you to WAPP and to the Program on Negotiation for co-hosting this. And Laura's going to pop some of these links for you in the chat box.
Beautiful job, Hannah. Thank you so much. That was such an inspiring presentation. It's making me want to jump into all the other seminars already and learn from all of the presenters who you previewed. And you did a really beautiful job summarizing the whole field, really inspirational. I just put a note in the chat inviting people to put questions into the chat. I'm not saying there will be time for everyone's questions, because if everyone puts them in, we won't have time, but please don't hesitate to put a question into the chat if you have one. We still have a few more minutes left, actually more than a few minutes. So we have a nice amount of time left. So I'll get the ball rolling by asking Hannah a question myself while we're waiting for people to put them in the chat. Hannah, I would love to hear you comment on the tension that negotiators face between one of the comments in the chat that happened earlier was a comment from Nazreen Nazir, who wrote, might this have something to do with stereotypes? So much of what you discussed seems to relate to stereotypes that are brought about by one's perceived gender or how that intersects with the cultural view of that gender. How do you think negotiators should manage the tension between fulfilling their gender stereotype, so acting in the way that the other party expects them to behave, which might be less likely to arouse kind of annoyance or frustration or negative affect in the other party, versus conforming to one's stereotype if that's the way to achieve an outcome? So maybe if your stereotype was to be very agentic, should you be agentic or should you be communal to help the relationship? And if your gender is stereotyped to be very communal, then should you be communal or fulfilling your gender stereotype, or should you be more agentic in order to achieve a better instrumental outcome in the negotiation? How should the negotiator go about reconciling that tension between fulfilling your stereotype versus doing the opposite?
Okay, that's a great question. I'm going to answer it at 3 levels. I'm self-conscious that Laura Cray, I see Laura, and Laura should be answering at least part of this question, but I'm just going to parrot a lot of her work. But actually, let me start off actually pulling on your research, Jared. One of the things that I really like about that paper that you have, and then some other related work in negotiation on reactants, and actually Laura's done stuff on reactants, but I think it's really important to recognize when we might be triggered by our awareness of stereotypes, because it could lead us to act in ways that are not our authentic selves. And I think Laura's shown this, and I think you've got some evidence of that. So if we are one thing that can happen if we have reactants is this idea that we feel constrained by others' expectations of us, and we act out to resist them. And so we may actually, if we think somebody is thinking we're soft as a leader or soft as a negotiator, we might just become more assertive than we would otherwise be, and then actually evoke maybe not be our best selves in the process. And so I think, one, it's really important to be kind of self-aware about whether we might be triggered or aware of that. I think what Laura's research, a really hopeful element of that from Laura's research, was the work that I mentioned earlier about one way to combat that is also to activate in one's own mind positively stereotypes identities as a negotiator, and you could also signal that to the other party, as a Kennedy School student, I loved, my negotiation courses, and as a trained negotiator, let me ask you these questions, and so I think there are ways of making salient positive identities. Laura also did this wonderful work on regenerating stereotypes. So instead of focusing on men are assertive, women are yielding, she would focus on things like women are effective collaborators, right? And so make salient in people's minds the stereotype of women as excellent collaborators, which then fulfills this idea of why you're going to be a great integrative mutual gains negotiator, etc. I think that actually, let me go back to one other that I meant to mention when I was looking at the organizations, is your work, Jared, on gender differences related to that in the, some of this evidence showing that women actually sometimes are less likely to achieve mutual gains, as high mutual gains, that is like those creative trades that expand the pie, than men are. And in part because they go too quickly to cooperation. And I always mention that when I do that with women's groups, that's an example of maybe a stereotype. We women are expecting we other women to be super cooperative with us. And if we don't push each other as well as cooperate, then we may actually leave value on the table. I think, so we talked about kind of getting reacting to the stereotype fulfillment, that you want to resist by thinking about activating positive stereotypes. There is the element of stereotypes where they're not descriptive, they're prescriptive. So if I attempt to assert myself, you might resist me as a result of it. And actually, when we go back to that last slide, when I was talking about more inclusive negotiation training, part of that stems from the fact that I worry actually about our running negotiation training programs for women or from people from other, historically marginalized groups that just tell them to assert yourself, just become a better, more assertive negotiator, because we could be sending them, into a situation where they're worse off as a result of the fact that they've attempted to negotiate. So I actually really think it's very important that we bring the best negotiation to bear when we're working with groups that may encounter those prescriptive stereotypes, those assumptions that you should kind of be grateful and be collaborative and not be self-asserting.
Thanks. Hannah, you actually answered a couple of questions that just came in on the chat. I was wondering if Daphne maybe would like to ask your question about negotiating on behalf of others.
Yes. So, Hannah, thank you. Just wanted to ask, have you noticed in your research, or maybe cite any other research, where context might even if if gender is salient, irrespective of the context, do you notice what might get in the way when women are more likely to negotiate better for others versus negotiating for themselves? What are some of those ambiguity or some of those barriers that might prevent them from negotiating themselves where they can do it for others, irrespective of the context?
So I think Jared picked on you. This is one of my absolute favorite questions. So we have a lot of data, data from a long time ago from me, but then subsequently replicated by a lot of other folks, that women do, following your intuition, negotiate more assertively on behalf of others than on behalf of themselves. So I think that one thing that I love about that finding, and the fact that it's been replicated, is that it really shows how silly the overgeneralizations are about women being less confident or assertive negotiators somehow globally than men are, when you just look at studies of self-advocacy, right? All you have to do is switch, whether you're negotiating for somebody else or yourself, and you see a difference in women's behavior. And that relates to this, some of the avoidance of the costs of self-assertion. So there's an upside and then a downside that I want to highlight from new research on that. So the upside of that is, I think you can also, so going back to Laura's work about how do you think about activating positively stereotyped identities, or the other research showing that more experienced negotiators are you're less likely to see gender effects with more experienced negotiators. I think that women can get gratification and experience from all of those situations that they're in when they are advocating for others, and carry that into situations, carry that experience, those insights, and that sense of self-efficacy into their negotiations when they're advocating for themselves. But one thing that's really interesting is that there's new research. A lot of the research traditionally has shown that women are more ethical negotiators than men. Like, they're kind of less likely to sort of distort or hide information and stuff. And actually, what's really interesting is, and in particular, like if the situation is framed as being highly competitive, that can trigger more kind of questionable behavior, more on the behalf of men than women, although it can trigger both men and women. But women are kind of more likely to dissimulate or when they're negotiating on behalf of others than for themselves. which is kind of interesting. So it's something to also a little thing to kind of keep in mind, whether, you know, we can be too much of a good thing sometimes.
So here's a question, Marcy, if you'd like to unmute yourself, or actually we will unmute you. Maybe you could ask your question about the environment in the US and how it's changed and how that might affect the dynamics that we're talking about.
Hi, Hannah. Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for this. Wonderful and so timely, because I've noticed, and I wondered if you could comment, or if we need to get serious about analyzing the changed environment here in the United States since Dobbs, and what that particularly relating to negotiation and the environment in which you enter a room and you know what your strengths and weaknesses are. I've had this with young women negotiating for jobs, and just the question about maternity has changed as it relates to whether or not you're going to take time off with, and I mean, the whole dynamic has changed, even in states where this is not the case. Just from being a female citizen in the United States, our presence in a room has changed in my estimation and assessment of how we carry ourselves and think of our futures. So I wonder what you might add to that, or tell us if something is going to be looked at.
You know, I think that's such an important question. By the way, you all are listening to Marcy Sims, who's a very important organizer around the Equal Rights Amendment here in the United States, very important advocate for women's rights at a policy level. You know, I think that we're seeing two things, Marcy. I think in some ways, I think that what a lot of us feel as is like overreaching, and some of the overt sexism that has, all right, so the Me Too movement had an enormously dramatic effect, but the Me Too movement also was in part, I think, in response to some of this kind of rising overt sexism and some of the like really violent and oppressive kind of sexism that was boiling to the surface. And so I think in part, actually, what we're seeing is some women feeling more empowered, more really feeling like this has just gone way too far, and it is unambiguous that I need to stand up, and that we need to organize, and that we need to get together. So I think among some women that there could be benefits to this moment where there's a kind of political ripening, and I think also that some of the folks who would like to take away from these rights are finding that they don't have as much support in the general population as they were expecting. At the same time, something that I think you're pointing out at is again, this is going to vary across contexts. And there are parts of the United States where very traditional notions of women's place is becoming not only more socially acceptable, but actually now, you know, institutionalized. And so I think, you know, I think we're in this, I keep thinking about the K-shaped recovery, you know, that we kept talking about coming out of COVID. You know, I think in some ways, you know, there's some women right now, I think, are rising and organizing and will benefit from this moment. And then there are clearly women whose welfare is going to be meaningfully constrained by this kind of backlash and tug of war. I think this is extremely important. I think one thing that's going to be really important, and I'm sure, Marcy, you are doing this, is talking to employers and how employers respond in these environments where I think that you're going to see state legislators and politicians are behind where the major employers are in these states, and whether, you know, major employers are going to be able to put a kind of pressure of the market as well as just, you know, political norms and mind share, you know, kind of grabbing people's mind share to put pressure, to push back on this. But I really wish I were asking you that question because you would have a really kind of brilliant answer, I'm sure. I hope I get a chance to talk to you soon to hear your reflections. Do we have time for maybe one more quick question, Jared?
Yeah, maybe we could go to Rati next. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Really interesting question about whether we can or should, with training, be able to remove gender completely from the negotiation.
Yeah, Hannah, you teach so many strategies for mastering negotiations by both understanding the situation, what to negotiate, who you are, who they are. So let's say we are masters now. We know how to negotiate. Can the gender thing be basically removed or minimized, just not even be a factor if we learn all these things?
Well, and again, Rati is a leader in very important. She was a accomplished leader in the tech field and is now advancing women of color in tech. And I think, Rati, I mean, going back to a point that I made earlier, I don't think just equipping people with skills is sufficient, you know. And I think what's really important, and I think this reflects also your leadership development work, Rati, is that we need to be equipping. We need to be working from the bottom up and the top down. I mean, it's really important that we set, like, you know, like we were talking about with like Jared's work in the work that's done in his area around work family stuff. It's not just about making people better negotiators to work family. There needs to be a kind of an organizational climate, norm, and capacity to entertain those negotiations. And then I think the negotiations are absolutely critical to the problem solving. I don't think we need to be, you know, equipping women or women of color or like young people from historically marginalized groups just to be better negotiators. I think we need to be doing that in the context of working with organizations, but then also, as I said before, helping them not only be better negotiators, understanding the principles, but then getting them access to that information and those resources that help them to reduce the ambiguity. So they understand very clearly, what can I potentially negotiate here? How do I go about doing this? How can I most effectively negotiate on my own or with others in order to make change? I think it's I think it's critical that we not pretend it's about the skills alone.
That's great. Well, we are basically out of time, although there are so many more questions that we can look at afterwards in the chat. We'll definitely save the chat and hopefully be able to come back to them. Just to give credit where credit is due, Hannah, you keep saying Jared's work at MIT. So I'm not part of the work that Hannah just referenced. It's actually a group at MIT called the Institute for Work and Employment Research. So I don't want to take credit for my colleagues' work, but there it is in the chat if people would like to see more about that work.
Aaron Kelly and all that crap, yes.
And yeah, exactly. And so thank you so much, Hannah, once again. This was terrific, really inspirational. And I'm so glad that we're at the beginning of this journey together.
Grateful to be doing it together. Thank you, everybody. Thanks so much for tuning in. Really appreciate it.